Welcome to the case of the Galvanic Ghost, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series Holmes and the New Century, the Edwardian Enigmas, playing in the year 1907. My descendants have recently unearthed these notebooks, a private chronicle of my time with Mr. Sherlock Holmes. In those early years of the new century, with Dr. Watson often occupied, I witnessed Holmes confront enigmas born of modern invention and shifting society. These are the Edwardian enigmas, cases I documented with a journalist's eye, perhaps less romantic than Watson's, but no less astonishing. Let us begin, then, with a most peculiar affair that unfolded within the hallowed halls of the Royal Institution. I have titled this singular mystery, The Case of the Galvanic Ghost. Chapter 1. The November fog, a greasy yellow vapour, had clung to the city for days, and its spectral fingers seemed to be probing at the very window panes of our lodgings at 221B Baker Street. A dreary rhythm was set by the steady drip of moisture from the eaves and the ceaseless rumble of distant traffic. Inside, the cheerful crackle of our hearth was a welcome counterpoint. I had laid aside my paper, watching my friend Sherlock Holmes, who sat opposite in his armchair, his stillness betraying a coiled intellectual energy. His chin was sunk upon his chest, and from the long-stemmed clay pipe clenched between his teeth, a fragrant blue haze ascended in a lazy spiral, a physical manifestation of the complex thoughts no doubt churning within his remarkable mind. Suddenly, a new sound intruded upon our quietude. Heavy, determined footsteps ascending our 17 stairs. They were far too solid for a client in distress, and possessed a certain official cadence that could belong to only one man, Lestrade. I should know the tread of a Scotland Yard man anywhere. He brings a problem, Watson, and I dare say from the urgency of his ascent, it is one he finds particularly vexing, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Holmes had barely finished his pronouncement when a sharp rap echoed on the door. A moment later, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard stood upon our threshold, his stout form silhouetted against the gloom of the landing. He was a bulldog of a man, tenacious and brave, but with little of the imaginative faculty that so distinguished my friend. Holmes, a word, if you're not otherwise engaged. A queer business over at the Royal Institution. I expect it's nothing for you, really, an open and shut case of accidental death, but the papers will make a meal of it. Inspector Lestrade replied. Pray, take a seat by the fire, Lestrade, and tell us of it. An accident so straightforward that it requires your personal attendance at my door must have some singular feature, Sherlock Holmes responded. Lestrade grunted, settling his bulk into the chair I offered. He seemed to fill the small space with the scent of damp wool and the palpable weight of a case that refused to make sense. It's a Mr. Edward Abernathy, a physicist of some note, found this morning in his private laboratory, stone dead. The coroner says it was electricity, a massive jolt of it. His laboratory is filled with all manner of wires and galvanic batteries. It appears the poor devil simply made a fatal error, Inspector Lestrade said. Holmes had closed his eyes, a familiar sign of his most intense concentration, not disinterest. With a languid hand, he bade the inspector to continue. A dreadful business, to be sure. But where precisely does the mystery lie in such a tragedy, Lestrade? remarked Dr. John Watson. "That's just it, Doctor. There isn't one, except for a trifling detail. The laboratory door was bolted from the inside. We had to break it down to gain entry," said Inspector Lestrade. The effect of these words upon my friend was instantaneous. Holmes's eyes snapped open, and they shone with a sudden hawk-like intensity. He sat bolt upright, the languor vanishing as if it had been a cloak he had shrugged off. "Bolted from the inside, you say, and you still call this an accident?" observed Sherlock Holmes. "Of course, what else could it be? The man was alone. He fumbled with his apparatus, received the fatal shock, and that was the end of it. The door is merely a coincidence," responded Inspector Lestrade. "My dear Lestrade, your capacity for overlooking the essential is a truly remarkable gift. Consider the sequence. A man cannot deliver a lethal electrical charge unto himself, and then, in the instant of his own demise, proceed to slide a heavy bolt across his laboratory door. The proposition is a physical impossibility. No, the bolt was not a coincidence. It is the very heart of the matter. It is the deliberate signature of a mind that wished us to believe this was a suicide or an accident." Sherlock Holmes responded. Lestrade stared, his mouth slightly agape, the flaw in his logic laid bare before him. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his expression shifting from confidence to bewilderment. "This is no accident, Inspector. This is murder. A murder, I dare say, of a most ingenious and audacious nature. Watson, my coat and hat. It appears we have a visit to make to the Royal Institution." For a full quarter-hour after Lestrade's departure, Holmes remained silent, a rare stillness for his mercurial temperament. The air in our Baker Street rooms grew thick with the aroma of his strongest shag tobacco, blue wreaths of smoke spiraling slowly towards the ceiling. Outside, evening fog drew a damp veil across London, muffling the clatter of carriage wheels to a distant rumble. The fire hissed and popped, the sole sound accompanying our thoughts on the peculiar death of Mr. Edward Abernathy. "An accident, Watson. Lestrade sees a simple, albeit tragic accident. A man of science undone by his own apparatus. It is tidy, it is convenient, and it is almost certainly wrong," observed Sherlock Holmes. Before I could reply, a frantic pounding echoed from our front door. A sharp clatter followed on the stairs, the sound of feet taking them two at a time. Our sitting-room door flew open, and a young man, pale as a spectre and gasping for breath, stumbled across the threshold. Though well-dressed, his cravat was askew, his hair dishevelled, and he clutched a crumpled hat in one trembling hand. "Mr. Holmes, I must speak with you. It is a matter of life and death, or rather of a death." Mr. Cyril Phelps answered. Holmes rose from his armchair in a single fluid motion. His earlier languor utterly vanished. His eyes, sharp and piercing, catalogued every detail of our visitor's agitated state. "Pray, compose yourself, sir, and take a seat. You have run a considerable distance, I see, all the way from South Kensington, if the particular clay upon your boots is any indication. You are Mr. Cyril Phelps, are you not?" stated Sherlock Holmes. The young man stared, his jaw slack with astonishment. "But how could you possibly know my name?" replied Mr. Cyril Phelps. "I read your employer's name upon the brass plaque at the institution but last week. and I know that Mr. Abernathy kept but one assistant. Given the circumstances, the conclusion is elementary. Now, tell me why a man of science has abandoned his laboratory in such a state of panic, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Mr. Phelps swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He sat on the edge of the proffered chair, his knuckles white where he gripped his hat. "The police, they are calling it an accident, a malfunction of the galvanic battery. But it was no accident, Mr. Holmes. It was murder," remarked Mr. Cyril Phelps. "Indeed. And what leads you to this conviction?" Sherlock Holmes said. A new current of intensity vibrated beneath Holmes's level tone. "My employer, Mr. Abernathy, he was on the verge of exposing a great scandal, a fraud of the most egregious nature. He had proof that the celebrated work of Dr. Alistair Finch, his lauded theories on electrodynamic forces, was built upon fabricated data. Mr. Cyril Phelps answered. The name, Dr. Alistair Finch, hung heavy in the air between us. He was a titan of the scientific community, a man whose reputation was thought to be unassailable. The implication was monstrous. Mr. Abernathy was to present his findings to the board of the Royal Institution tomorrow. He told me so himself not 2 days ago. He said it would be the end of Finch's career, but that the truth must be served. And now he is dead." Holmes stood before the fire, his tall, gaunt figure a silhouette against the flames. The puzzle was no longer a mere electrical event. It now possessed the vital element he had found lacking. Motive, Watson. Lestrade's tidy accident now has a most powerful and compelling motive. A man's entire legacy was at stake. For that, some would surely kill, Sherlock Holmes noted. He turned back to our trembling client, his voice now crisp and decisive. "Mr. Phelps, your instincts have served you well. This is no longer a matter for the constabulary's routine inquiries. It is a problem of the most singular nature. Watson, your hat and coat. We make for the Royal Institution at once. We must see this silent laboratory for ourselves before the official bunglers obscure every vital clue." The laboratory at the Royal Institution was a chamber of silent marvels and profound gloom. As we entered, the scent of ozone and stale pipe tobacco hung heavy in the air, a strange perfume of scientific endeavour and human tragedy. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard met us at the threshold, his stout form silhouetted against the tall, grimy windows. A low, persistent hum, its source unseen, seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards, a subtle tremor beneath our feet. "At last, Holmes. I tell you, it is a sad but simple affair. The poor devil, Mr. Abernathy, must have crossed a wire. This modern electricity is a fickle servant," Inspector Lestrade replied. "An accident is a conclusion, Lestrade, and I prefer to arrive at my conclusions at the end of my investigation, not the beginning," Sherlock Holmes said. My friend's sharp voice cut through the inspector's bluster. Without another word, Holmes strode past him and began his singular examination. He did not go to the chalk outline on the floor, but rather to the heavy oak door through which we had entered. With a resonant thud, he shot the heavy iron bolt into its housing. This bolt was thrown from the inside. The key, which your constable found on the victim's person, was in the lock, also on the inside. Correct? observed Sherlock Holmes. "Of course. That is why we had to break it down. The man locked himself in," said Inspector Lestrade. Holmes offered no reply. With a cat-like tread, he moved to the first of the tall windows, his long, nimble fingers testing the brass latch. It refused to yield with a dull click. He moved to the next, and the next, each proving as secure as the last. Only the faint rattle of a passing hansom cab on the street below broke the intense quiet of his work. "They are all sealed, Holmes, painted shut years ago, and bolted for good measure. I have had my best men confirm it," remarked Inspector Lestrade. Ignoring him, Holmes knelt before the small, soot-blackened fireplace. He struck a match, the sudden flare casting his aquiline features in a demonic light as he peered up the chimney flue. A small shower of grit pattered onto the hearth. The flue is narrow and choked with the deposits of a decade. No man, nor even a boy, could have passed through it. Therefore, Inspector, we can state with absolute certainty that when Mr. Abernathy died, this room was hermetically sealed from within. No one entered and no one left, stated Sherlock Holmes. Only then did he turn his attention to the victim's final position. He circled the chalk outline, his grey eyes sweeping over the array of glass bulbs and coiled copper wires that crowded the benches, his gaze as intense as a hawk searching for its prey. He died of a massive electrical charge, and yet I see no wire that could have delivered it. No conductor leads to this spot. He was struck down by an invisible bolt from the heavens, it would seem, in a room no force could penetrate, explained Sherlock Holmes. Holmes knelt, his face inches from the floorboards, pointing towards where the victim's hand would have been. Armitage and I leaned closer, our eyes following his gesture. Between the chalked fingers of the outline, something the police had evidently overlooked caught the light, a tiny glint of metal. "Good heavens, what is it?" replied Henry Armitage. Holmes lifted the object with his tweezers. It was a small brass pin, no longer than my thumbnail, its shaft marked by a peculiar spiral groove. A pin, Holmes? The man was an inventor. His laboratory is full of such odds and ends. It is a trifle, of no consequence, I assure you, replied Inspector Lestrade. Holmes carefully slipped the pin into a specimen envelope, his movements precise and deliberate. He rose to his feet, a flicker of triumph in his eyes that only I could recognize. "My dear Lestrade, in a case with no doors, no windows, and no weapon, the smallest trifle may become the fulcrum upon which the entire world turns. We have established the impossibility of the event. Now we must pursue the architect of that impossibility. Come, Armitage, we have imposed enough upon the inspector's time," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. And as we turned to leave, Holmes's voice dropped to a low, energetic hum, a sound that always spoke to me of the thrill of the chase. The room tells us how it could not have been done. Now we must find the one man with the genius and the motive to achieve it. Our next port of call is the laboratory of Dr. Alistair Finch, declared Sherlock Holmes. The corridors of the Royal Institution were unnaturally quiet, our footsteps echoing on the polished flagstones, each sound amplified in the unnatural quiet like the tolling of a solemn bell.
It was a hall dedicated to the thunderous pronouncements of science, now reduced to a conspiratorial hush. The office of Dr. Alistair Finch was at the end of a long gallery, its mahogany door as imposing and unadorned as the man himself. Holmes rapped twice, a sharp, inquisitive sound that seemed to challenge the silence. The door opened abruptly, not by a clerk, but by the doctor himself. A tall man, ramrod straight, he seemed to fill the doorway, his sharp, angled face a mask of impatience. A faint, almost imperceptible hum, a constant thrum of latent power, emanated from some unseen apparatus within the room. His voice was as crisp and precise as snapping glass. "Mr. Holmes, I presume? I was told to expect you. And you must be Mr. Armitage. The police have already wasted a considerable portion of my morning. I trust you will be more efficient," Dr. Alistair Finch said. He did not invite us to sit, but remained standing rigidly before his vast desk, a silent challenge for us to state our purpose and be gone. The room was a monument to his mind, orderly, severe, and filled with strange contraptions of brass and coiled wire. Holmes's tone was deceptively mild. "We investigate murder, Doctor, not waste time. You were a colleague of the late Dr. Thorne. Indeed, I hear you were his chief rival," explained Sherlock Holmes. A flicker of contempt, so brief I might have imagined it, crossed Finch's sharp features. He then gave a short, humourless laugh that was more of a scoff. "Rival? My dear sir, a battleship does not have a rivalry with a canoe. Thorne was a plodder, a man of limited imagination, who believed meticulous record-keeping was a substitute for genius. His death, while unfortunate, was the inevitable result of his meddling with forces beyond his meagre comprehension, an accident born of incompetence," responded Dr. Alistair Finch. "Yet the room was sealed from within. An accident of that nature would require a rather complex and invisible accomplice, would it not?" Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Dr. Finch waved a dismissive hand, the starched cuff of his shirt rustling sharply in the quiet room. "The police are baffled by a simple lock. I am not. There are a dozen explanations: a faulty circuit, a residual charge, static accumulation. To leap to murder is the mark of a theatrical mind, not a scientific one. As to my own involvement, I am afraid I must disappoint you," responded Dr. Alistair Finch. He turned to his desk and picked up a printed program, tapping it with a long, slender finger. The paper crinkled with an air of finality. "At the estimated time of Thorne's demise, between 8 and 9 o'clock, I was here, in this very building, delivering a public lecture to over 200 members of the public and the press. My topic," he added, his voice laced with insufferable pride, "was the principles of wireless power transmission. Action at a distance. A concept poor Thorne could never grasp. You will find my alibi is, I believe the term is, ironclad." He placed the program on the desk as if it were a winning card. Holmes, however, paid it no mind. From his waistcoat pocket he had produced a small object which he now rolled between his thumb and forefinger. It was a curious little brass pin, glinting in the low light. His focus on this trifle was absolute before his gaze shifted, not to Finch, but to an intricate coil of copper wire on the corner of the desk. "Action at a distance," he murmured. almost to himself. "A fascinating and most pertinent subject. Thank you for your time, Doctor. You have been most illuminating," replied Sherlock Holmes.
The heavy door clicked shut behind us with metallic finality, sealing us back in the corridor's silence. A wave of defeat washed over me. The man's arrogance was infuriating, but his alibi seemed unassailable. Holmes, however, appeared anything but discouraged. He stopped abruptly and turned to me, his grey eyes alight with a familiar fire. "Finch has built a fortress of logic around himself, Armitage. But every fortress has a flaw in its foundations. His very certainty is a tell. While I examine the bricks and mortar of this crime, such as the curious little brass pin I noted near the threshold, you must investigate the architect." He paused, his voice dropping to a more serious register. "I need the human element. Speak to Thorne's laboratory assistant, to the junior fellows, to anyone who will talk. Uncover the whispers that Finch's booming voice is meant to drown out. Find me the motive, Armitage. I suspect it is coiled as tightly as the wires on his desk," declared Sherlock Holmes. We returned to Baker Street to find the familiar blue haze of Holmes's shag tobacco hanging in the air, a sign of his deepest concentration. The interview with Dr. Alistair Finch had left the police satisfied. Holmes, however, remained unconvinced. He paced before the hearth, a caged tiger turning a problem over and over in his singular mind. The rhythmic tap of his leather slippers on the floorboards was the only sound for a long while, save for the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn on the Thames. An alibi, Armitage, is merely a puzzle within a puzzle. Dr. Finch has told us precisely where he was, but in doing so he has inadvertently told us what he was thinking about. Wireless power. It is too convenient, too perfect a piece of misdirection, observed Sherlock Holmes. His voice was steady, a counterpoint to Holmes's restless energy. "So you believe his lecture is not a defence, but a clue?" replied Henry Armitage. "I believe it is the very heart of the matter. While I re-examine the physical particulars of this locked room, you must dissect the social anatomy of the Royal Institution. Motive, Armitage, that is what we lack. Start with the laboratory assistant, this Mr. Phelps. A man in his position sees everything and is often invisible himself. Uncover the rot beneath the polished floorboards of that august establishment," Sherlock Holmes said. Armitage departed at once, and it was not until late that evening, as a cold rain began to patter against our window panes, that he returned. He looked weary, but his eyes held the glint of discovery as he recounted his day to Holmes and me over a much-needed glass of port. He described the Royal Institution's library, a vast and silent chamber, where the only sounds were the rustle of turning pages and the solemn ticking of a great-grandfather clock. It was there, in a shadowed alcove, that he found Mr. Cyril Phelps. The man's nerves were evidently frayed to the breaking point, for he started violently when a book was closed with a sharp clap some distance away. "Mr. Phelps, I mean you no harm. I am assisting Mr. Holmes in his inquiries," answered Henry Armitage. Phelps, Armitage told us, had flinched at the name, his voice a strained and barely audible whisper. "Holmes? I cannot speak of it. Dr. Finch, he has ears everywhere. It is not safe," remarked Mr. Cyril Phelps. Armitage persisted, his calm tone a balm on the young man's palpable fear, until at last the dam of silence broke. Phelps moved closer, his words tumbling out in a torrent of hushed confession. It was the resonance data. My master, Dr. Blackwood, was on the verge of a breakthrough in galvanic transmission, a way to transmit power without a wire. Finch stole his preliminary findings, published them as his own theoretical work. It was going to make his name, but Dr. Blackwood had the proof, the original notebooks. He was to present them to the board. It would have meant utter ruin for Finch, professional and personal annihilation, said Mr. Cyril Phelps. Armitage had then spoken to others, more senior and far more guarded, but had pieced together a clear picture of a brilliant man driven to the edge by the imminent exposure of his grand deceit. The motive was no longer a shadow. It was a stark and desperate reality. Back in our rooms, the fire crackled in the grate, casting dancing shadows on Holmes's face. He had listened to Armitage's report without interruption, his eyes closed. When the account was finished, he opened them, and they burned with a cold, clear light. Annihilation. He repeated the word softly, the sound hanging in the smoky air. A powerful motive indeed. He lectures on the very principles he stole, whilst the man he stole them from is silenced by an invisible bolt of lightning. The arrogance is sublime, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Holmes rose from his chair and retrieved the small, peculiar brass pin from the mantelpiece. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, turning it so it gleamed in the gaslight. Finch has given us the theory, Armitage. Now this small object must tell us of the practice. It is no ordinary pin. Its construction is too specific, too deliberate. We require a man whose knowledge of electrical apparatus is not merely theoretical, but deeply practical. Watson, fetch your coat. We are paying a visit to Professor Davies, explained Sherlock Holmes. With Armitage's report confirming the deep-seated professional animosity between Dr. Finch and the deceased, the motive for the crime lay bare. Yet motive alone cannot send a man to the gallows. As our hansom cab jolted and rattled over the cobblestones towards the university, Holmes sat in profound silence, his long fingers steepled, his gaze unwavering upon the small velvet-lined box resting on his lap. The chaotic symphony of London, the clang of a distant tram bell, the cries of newsboys, the rhythmic clopping of hooves, failed to penetrate his concentration in the slightest. The human heart, Armitage, is a known territory, he said at last, his voice a low murmur against the carriage's rattle. Its passions are as predictable as the tides. But this is a question of physics, not feeling, and in that realm I am a mere amateur. We require an expert, Sherlock Holmes noted. Our destination was the office of Professor Quentin Davis, a man whose name was synonymous with the burgeoning field of electrical engineering. A porter ushered us into a chamber that was less an office and more a living testament to a life spent in study. Books overflowed from shelves, diagrams of intricate circuits papered every wall, and the air itself hummed with the faint metallic scent of ozone and old paper. A tall grandfather clock in the corner marked the passing seconds with a deep, sonorous tick that seemed to be the very heartbeat of the room. Mr. Holmes, an unexpected pleasure.
The professor's voice was as dry as rustling parchment, and he peered at us over a pair of silver-rimmed spectacles. "To what do I owe this visit? I trust it is not another matter of forged banknotes and electrolytic etching," answered Professor Quentin Davies.
"Something rather more singular, Professor," Holmes replied, stepping forward. He carefully opened the small box and, with a pair of tweezers, lifted the curious brass pin, placing it upon a clean sheet of blotting paper on the professor's cluttered desk. "I should be most grateful for your opinion on this trifle," Sherlock Holmes noted.
Professor Davis leaned forward, his initial air of mild amusement swiftly evaporating as he studied the object. He retrieved a large magnifying glass, and for a long moment the only sounds were the steady ticking of the clock and the soft whisper of the professor's breath. He rotated the pin slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration. His eye traced the strange sigil upon its head, then the precise calibration of its length and the peculiar fluting near its tip.
"The police have dismissed it as a decorative tie-pin of foreign manufacture," Holmes stated quietly. "I believe, however, that its purpose is altogether more functional. Note the specific alloy, a high-conductivity copper-zinc blend, and the tip shows microscopic evidence of arcing. It has completed a circuit, and a powerful one at that," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. The professor set down his glass with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. His gaze darted from the pin to Holmes, and a new light of understanding and something akin to alarm flashed in his eyes. He shoved his spectacles up onto his forehead, his stare fixed upon my friend. "Good heavens, man, where did you find this? This is no tie-pin. This is not a component one happens upon by chance," responded Professor Quentin Davies. Holmes simply watched him, his face impassive, waiting. The professor lifted the object again, his fingers now cradling it with a new-found respect, a delicacy one might afford a vial of poison. "This is a key, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "A bespoke safety key, designed to disengage a very particular and exceedingly dangerous class of apparatus," answered Professor Quentin Davies. Professor Quentin Davis's office was a sanctuary of ordered thought, a stark contrast to the chaotic puzzle we presented. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather spines forming a tapestry of knowledge. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and wood polish, and the only sound was the steady metronomic tick of a tall grandfather clock in the corner. The professor, a man whose bright eyes darted with bird-like curiosity, turned the small brass pin over and over in his slender fingers, holding it to the light of the gas lamp on his desk. "It is a most elegant piece of machining. The tolerances are exceptionally fine. Where did you say you acquired this, Mr. Holmes?" said Professor Quentin Davies. "It was discovered upon the floor of a laboratory near the body of a man who had met a most shocking end," explained Sherlock Holmes. The professor's academic interest sharpened into a look of grave concern. He placed the pin carefully upon a leather blotter as if it were a venomous insect. He rose from his chair, its legs scraping softly against the polished floorboards, and moved to a vast bookshelf. After a moment's search, his fingers retrieved a heavy, dark green volume. The rustle of stiff pages turning filled the quiet room. "Ah, just as I suspected. Look here, gentlemen.
responded Professor Quentin Davies. He pointed to a detailed diagram of a complex electrical apparatus, a web of coils and wires that meant little to me. His finger rested upon a component identical in shape to the object on his desk. This is a schematic for a high-voltage resonant transformer, an exceedingly dangerous device capable of generating an electrical field of immense power. This pin, as you call it, is not a mere component. It is a safety key. Holmes leaned forward, his expression one of intense concentration. The gas lamp cast his hawkish features in sharp relief. "A safety key. Explain its function, if you would," declared Sherlock Holmes. "Its function is to prevent catastrophe. When inserted, it breaks the primary circuit, rendering the machine inert. It is a physical interlock. To remove it is to arm the device. It becomes a loaded weapon, waiting only for a current," responded Professor Quentin Davis. A cold dread settled in my stomach. The implications were monstrous. This was no accident, but a carefully set trap. "Then its absence is what made the apparatus lethal?" replied Henry Armitage. "Precisely. It is an act that requires deliberate intent and specialist knowledge. One does not simply misplace such a critical safeguard," responded Professor Quentin Davies. Holmes picked up the pin once more, his gaze fixed upon the small, intricate emblem on its head. "One final question, Professor. This mark, have you ever seen its like before?" replied Sherlock Holmes. Professor Davies retrieved a magnifying glass from a drawer and peered closely at the emblem. The clock in the corner seemed to hold its breath. After a long moment, the professor lowered the glass, his face pale. "I have. There can be no mistake. It is a gear and a lightning bolt," Professor Quentin Davies replied. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, heavy with significance. "It is the personal maker's mark of Dr. Alistair Finch," responded Professor Quentin Davies. "The name fell into the silent room like a stone into a deep well. The tangible link we had sought at last secured." With a curt nod, his lips set in a grim line, Holmes thanked the professor. We took our leave, the heavy oak door closing behind us with a soft thud. "It is undeniable, then. Finch is the man," answered Henry Armitage. Holmes did not reply at once. He stared ahead as we descended the stone steps into the courtyard, where the afternoon fog thickened, muffling the distant sounds of London traffic. "We have the architect of the crime, Armitage, that much is certain. The pin is his signature upon the deed. Yet we are faced with a greater problem than motive or means. We are faced with the paradox of the man's alibi," Sherlock Holmes noted. "He was delivering a lecture on wireless power transmission to 200 members of the institution at the very moment his colleague was slain. An alibi of solid iron. And I begin to suspect that the key to this entire affair lies not in shattering that alibi, but in understanding that the lecture itself was the final, critical component of the murder weapon," deduced Sherlock Holmes. Professor Davis's revelation about the safety key had cast a palpable stillness over our rooms at 221B Baker Street. The damning evidence, Finch's personal maker's mark, lay upon the mantelpiece. Yet Holmes had fallen into one of his profound and unnerving silences. For hours, the only sounds were the soft hiss of the gas lamp, the occasional crackle of the coals in the grate, and the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn from the Thames. I watched as he sat motionless in his armchair, his long, thin fingers steepled before him, his eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the intricate patterns of the rug. Suddenly, he sprang to his feet with a cat-like agility that belied his stillness. The sudden movement made me start. He began to pace the room, a caged tiger weaving a path between the cluttered furniture. The floorboards groaned rhythmically under his impatient stride. "The alibi, Watson, it is too perfect. An alibi of iron, forged in the public eye, witnessed by half the scientific community of London. A man cannot be in two places at once. It is a fundamental law," Sherlock Holmes noted. "But Holmes, we have established that he was there. Inspector Gregson himself confirmed it. Dr. Finch delivered his lecture at the Royal Institution at the precise hour his colleague met his end across the city. There is no question of it," commented Dr. John Watson. He stopped his pacing and snatched a sheaf of papers from the table, his eyes scanning the lines with a ferocious intensity. It was the transcript of Finch's lecture, along with the newspaper clippings that lauded his performance. "No question of his location, certainly. But we have been guilty of a grave error, my dear fellow. We have been examining his alibi as a proof of innocence, a matter of time and place. We have failed to examine it for what it truly is," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He fell silent again, but it was a different silence now, not of contemplation, but of imminent discovery. His gaze was locked on a single phrase in the newspaper report. I could hear the faint ticking of the carriage clock on the mantel, each second seeming to stretch into an eternity. A sharp intake of breath from Holmes broke the spell. "Good heavens, Watson, it is beautiful in its audacity. The subject of the lecture. We noted it, yet we did not see. What was the title?" deduced Sherlock Holmes. "Some technical matter," I replied, consulting my notes. "On the transmission of electrical power without conducting wires. A demonstration of his new theories on," wondered Dr. John Watson. He cut me off with a triumphant cry, slapping the papers down upon the table with a crack that echoed in the quiet room. "Precisely. He was not merely talking, Watson, he was demonstrating. He stood upon that stage and showed 100 men how he could send power through the very air. We have been looking for the murderer's hand when we should have been looking for his intellect," Sherlock Holmes said. His eyes burned with a feverish light, the unmistakable sign of a mind that had finally grasped the solution to an impossible problem. The pieces were slotting into place within that magnificent mind, forming a picture that remained a complete muddle to my own. His voice dropped, now filled with a chilling certainty. "Finch's alibi is not a defense, Watson. It is a confession. He did not need to be in that laboratory to commit the murder. He announced, with theatrical flourish, the very method by which he killed a man from miles away. The alibi of iron was, in fact, the murder weapon itself." Sherlock Holmes responded. The profound silence that had fallen over our rooms at 221B Baker Street was of a peculiar and electric quality. Holmes, who moments before had been staring into the fire with a look of vacant frustration, was now transformed. He had sprung from his chair as if jolted by a galvanic current himself, and now paced the length of our worn Persian rug, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, and a fierce, triumphant light burning in his grey eyes. The low crackle of the coals in the grate seemed to be the only sound in London.
"Good heavens, Holmes! What is it? Have you seen a ghost in the flames?" responded Dr. John Watson. He stopped his pacing and turned to face me, his expression so intense it was almost alarming. A thin, sharp smile played upon his lips. "Better than that, my dear Watson. I have seen the ghost's very method. We have been utter fools, blind to the most glaring fact of this entire affair. We have been staring at a confession and calling it an alibi," deduced Sherlock Holmes.
He snatched a sheet of foolscap from the writing desk, the paper crinkling sharply in the quiet room. A pen dipped into the inkwell, and with swift, decisive strokes he began to sketch. Consider Dr. Finch's lecture. Its subject? The transmission of electrical power without the medium of a wire. Action at a distance. He stood before 100 witnesses, demonstrating the very principle he was, at that exact moment, employing to commit murder. Sherlock Holmes responded. I felt a cold thrill pass through me as the monstrous simplicity of the notion began to dawn. The locked room, the invisible assailant, it was all beginning to coalesce into a terrifying logical whole. "You mean to say, from the lecture hall?" Dr. John Watson added. "Precisely. He did not need to be in the laboratory to throw the switch, for the switch was thrown by an invisible hand, a pulse of energy sent through the very air. With Armitage threatening to expose him as a fraud, Finch, desperate to protect his reputation, devised this fiendishly modern crime," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Holmes tossed the pen down with a clatter, then began to tick the points off on his long, thin fingers, enumerating them aloud. First, the motive. Imminent exposure of his fraud. Second, the opportunity. His earlier visit to the laboratory. Sherlock Holmes said, where he used the brass key not to enter, but to arm the apparatus. Dr. John Watson added, precisely. He connected it to a wireless receiver, creating a death trap. Third, the weapon. Armitage's own equipment turned against him. And finally, the alibi, the most brilliant stroke of all, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. I watched, captivated, as he spun on his heel to face me, his eyes alight. He commits the murder while in public, using the very science of his lecture as the fatal instrument. The galvanic ghost, Watson, was summoned by radio wave, Sherlock Holmes said. He stood there, a tall, gaunt figure silhouetted against the gaslight, the puzzle now entirely assembled in his mind. Outside, the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn sounded from the Thames, a fitting requiem for the dark deed now laid bare. His energy, however, was not abating. It was merely changing its focus from thought to action. His energy, however, was not abating. It was merely changing its focus from thought to action. There is but one thing left to do. We must give our phantom a reason to manifest once more. A trap must be laid, and the bait must be irresistible, explained Sherlock Holmes. His voice had become low and purposeful. He fixed me with a gaze that sent a shiver of anticipation down my spine.
Watson, I shall need you to send a telegram to Inspector Lestrade and another to young Phelps. Tell them to meet us at the Royal Institution in 1 hour. We are going to stage a little demonstration of our own."
The laboratory, which had seemed a place of brilliant discovery upon my first visit, now felt like a tomb. The great coils and glass spheres of Mr. Abernathy's galvanic apparatus stood silent, draped in dust sheets like funereal shrouds. A single gas lamp hissed from the wall, casting long dancing shadows that made the familiar instruments seem monstrous and strange. We were 5 men, assembled at Holmes's peculiar request. Myself, a grim-faced Inspector Lestrade, the perpetually trembling Mr. Phelps, and the man at the centre of it all, Dr. Alistair Finch, whose composure was as rigid and brittle as spun glass. Inspector Lestrade broke the silence, his boots scraping impatiently on the stone floor. "Well, Mr. Holmes, you've gathered us here like actors for a play. I trust the final act is about to commence. My time is not without value," replied Inspector Lestrade. Holmes paid Lestrade no mind, his gaze already fixed intently upon Dr. Finch.
"Patience, Inspector. A drama of this nature requires the proper staging. We stand upon the very spot where a man's life and work were brought to a violent end. But the cause was not, as was supposed, a mere accident," observed Sherlock Holmes. He began to pace slowly before the main workbench, his footfalls the only sound to break the oppressive silence. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and old chemicals. "We had a man of genius, Mr. Abernathy, on the cusp of a great revelation. We also had another man of equal brilliance, whose reputation was built upon a foundation of, let us say, borrowed ingenuity. A man who knew that Abernathy's next public disclosure would mean his own professional ruin. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Dr. Finch's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening where he gripped the back of a chair. Young Phelps, however, flinched as if struck. "This is outrageous. You are trafficking in slander, sir. Mere professional rivalry is not motive for murder," remarked Dr. Alistair Finch. Holmes stopped his pacing and turned, a sudden intensity in his manner. "Oh, but it is, Doctor. It is the oldest motive in the book, pride. The fear of being exposed as a fraud after a lifetime of accolades. You knew Abernathy had the proof. You had to silence him before his lecture," Sherlock Holmes noted. Lestrade shifted his weight, a flicker of genuine interest crossing his features. Holmes ignored him, his focus absolute. He reached into his waistcoat pocket. The problem, of course, was the locked room. How to kill a man from afar? A question for another moment. First, we must dispense with the fiction that the killer was never here at all. The police found the door bolted from the inside, and thus assumed Abernathy was alone when the fatal charge was delivered, observed Sherlock Holmes. With a flourish, Holmes produced a small, gleaming object from his waistcoat pocket and held it aloft in the gaslight. It was an intricately machined brass key, no bigger than my thumb, now imbued with a sinister importance. The young assistant recoiled with a gasp, his face paling in the dim light. "The safety key for the primary induction coil," said Mr. Cyril Phelps. Holmes nodded, his eyes never leaving Finch's face. "Precisely, Mr. Phelps. A unique key, custom-made for Dr. Finch's own demonstration apparatus, which he lent to Abernathy. A key without which the device cannot be fully armed. This key, gentlemen, was found clenched in the dead man's hand, deduced Sherlock Holmes. The implication fell into the silence of the room with the weight of a coffin lid. A physical object belonging to one man, found in the hand of another. It spoke not of an accident, but of a struggle, of a direct and desperate confrontation. His voice dropped, becoming sharp and accusatory as a surgeon's scalpel. This is the silent witness that tells us the truth. Abernathy was not alone. He confronted his killer here, in this room, and in the ensuing struggle tore this very key away. It is the proof, Dr. Finch, that your hands were the last to touch him before the galvanic ghost was summoned to do its work. A profound silence fell upon the laboratory, broken only by the faint, almost imperceptible hum of some distant electrical apparatus. The small brass key, resting on Holmes's palm, caught the gaslight, shining like a single, damning star. All eyes, including my own, were fixed upon Dr. Alistair Finch. The man's formidable composure had begun to unravel. A muscle twitched in his jaw, and his knuckles whitened where he gripped the back of a chair. This key, gentlemen, tells a story not of an accident, but of a confrontation. Mr. Abernathy anticipated your visit, Dr. Finch. He had this very safety key in his possession, ready to disable the galvanic cell, the source of the power you so masterfully command. There was a struggle here, in this very room, stated Sherlock Holmes. Holmes moved towards the heavy oak door, his stride measured and deliberate. Inspector Lestrade followed his every motion, a grudging admiration warring with profound bewilderment upon his face. This is absurd speculation. The door was bolted from within. You saw it yourself, Inspector, remarked Dr. Alistair Finch. Indeed. Bolted, it is true, but not by the man who lay dead within these walls. Mr. Abernathy was incapacitated long before the fatal charge was ever delivered. In your struggle, you struck him down. Then, with your victim senseless upon the floor, you set about constructing your masterpiece of illusion, deduced Sherlock Holmes. He pointed to a minute scratch on the brass housing of the bolt, a mark so faint my own eyes would have passed over it 100 times. Holmes then turned his gaze back to Finch. You had prepared for this, Doctor. A simple length of catgut looped through a tiny hole drilled here and passed under the door allowed you to draw the bolt shut from the corridor outside. A clever stratagem indeed. Once the bolt was home, you simply pulled the cord free. A locked room, with no key and no human intervention apparent, remarked Sherlock Holmes. But the electrical charge, the timing of it all, answered Inspector Lestrade. That, Inspector, is the stroke of pure diabolical genius. Dr. Finch's alibi was not an alibi at all. It was, in fact, the murder weapon, deduced Sherlock Holmes. A collective gasp went through our small company. Holmes pivoted, his piercing gaze pinning Finch in place. The doctor's face was now a pale, sweating mask of terror, his formidable composure utterly shattered. You left Mr. Abernathy here, senseless, connected to your dreadful apparatus.
You then proceeded to the lecture hall to deliver your triumphant demonstration on the wireless transmission of galvanic power. You had calibrated your device so that at the very crescendo of your performance, the grand display that earned you such thunderous applause, a secondary receiver hidden in this very room would be triggered. The applause of the Royal Institution, Doctor, was poor Abernathy's death knell. In that moment, the terrible ingenuity of the scheme lay bare for all to see. Finch had murdered a man from afar, using his own public triumph as the trigger, whilst surrounded by 100 witnesses. For a long moment, the only sound in the charged silence was the harsh rasp of Finch's ragged breathing. He was going to ruin me, to ruin everything. Decades of work, the very reputation of this institution, all to be sacrificed for his petty accusations. I gave him a chance to retract. He refused. Dr. Alistair Finch answered. The confession hung in the air, a poisonous vapour tainting the familiar scent of ozone and polished brass. Dr. Finch sagged against the chair, his great intellect finally broken by the weight of his crime. The heavy, deliberate tread of Inspector Lestrade's boots resounded behind me as he stepped forward to perform his duty. A profound silence descended upon the laboratory, a vacuum left by the cessation of Dr. Finch's torrent of technical detail and bitter justification. The great galvanic apparatus stood inert, its brass and copper coils gleaming dully under the gaslight, a monument to a brilliant mind's moral collapse. It was into this quiet that Inspector Lestrade entered, his footsteps echoing with a grim finality on the stone floor. There were no dramatics. Finch offered his wrists with a cold, almost academic detachment, his face a mask of stone. He was a man who had solved his final problem and found the answer to be his own ruin. The hansom cab ride back to Baker Street was a sombre affair. The rhythmic clatter of the horses' hooves on the wet cobblestones and the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn from the Thames were the only sounds that punctuated our shared thoughts. I watched the blurred gas lamps slide past the window, each a fleeting spark in the immense London dark, their reflections shimmering on the wet glass as I considered the tragedy we had just witnessed. Back in the familiar, cluttered comfort of our rooms at 221B, the warmth of the hearth was a welcome solace. A log shifted in the grate, sending a shower of orange sparks up the chimney. Holmes had already shed his coat and was now sunk deep into his armchair, the bowl of his old clay pipe glowing like a ruby in the dim light. The sharp, familiar scent of his shag tobacco began to cut through the lingering dampness of the night. A damnable business, Holmes, to see a mind of such calibre brought so low by simple pride. Henry Armitage replied. Holmes drew a long, contemplative stream of smoke, his eyes half closed as he watched it curl towards the ceiling. Pride was but the symptom, my dear Armitage. The disease was a uniquely modern one, the worship of progress as a god, with oneself as its high priest. Dr. Finch did not merely believe he was right. He believed his work was so important that it placed him beyond the petty constraints of right and wrong. Sherlock Holmes responded. His voice was low and resonant, the sharp edge of the chase now replaced by a philosopher's melancholy. He did not murder Abernathy simply to conceal a fraud. He murdered him to protect an ideal, the pristine, unblemished reputation of the institution, and, by extension, his own legacy within it. He saw Abernathy's inconvenient truth not as a necessary correction, but as an act of heresy against the great church of science, observed Sherlock Holmes. And the impossible crime, the sealed room, was that part of it? Remarked Henry Armitage.
Ah, that was the ultimate expression of his intellectual vanity. It was not enough to kill. He had to do so in a manner that would baffle the world. A final, ghastly demonstration of his superior intellect. He created a ghost from wire and waves, a phantom born of the very discoveries he sought to protect. He used a marvel of the new century to enact a crime as old as Cain, explained Sherlock Holmes. He fell silent, his long fingers steepled before him. The only sounds were the soft hiss of the gaslight and the gentle crackle of the fire. The case was solved, the murderer apprehended, yet there was no sense of triumph in the room, only a profound sense of waste.
We are charting new territories of knowledge every day, Armitage. We harness the ether, we master the atom. But we must never forget that the landscape of the human heart remains as treacherous and as unchanged as it has ever been. That is the true price of progress, the constant, vigilant battle against the darkness within ourselves, explained Sherlock Holmes.
With that, he rose and crossed the room to the mantelpiece. He took up his violin, tucked it beneath his chin, and drew the bow across the strings. A long, sorrowful melody began to fill the quiet air, a wordless epitaph for a brilliant man who reached for the stars and found only the abyss. The galvanic ghost was laid to rest, but its lesson, I knew, would linger long after the music had faded.